In Norway, where the monarchy survives on restraint, good manners, and the quiet national faith that nobody at the top will behave like a tabloid character, Mette-Marit has become the exception that keeps proving the rule. She's a crown princess with a wild past the country can recite by heart. Raves, drugs in the air, a child born outside marriage, men who drifted in and out of the police blotter. And she somehow made it into the most tradition-steeped room in the whole house. How did she do it? On the surface, there was a tearful confession delivered live on television, a wedding that dared the old moral order to keep up, and a public service career that for years looked like a hard-won second life. And then, just as the story seemed settled, the ground shifted violently. An illness that tightened the lungs, a friendship with the world's darkest individual that should have ended before it began, and a son whose name has become a national nightmare. Welcome to Society Mysteries. She arrived ludicrously far from any palace gates, in the coastal city of Kristiansand, born on the 19th of August 1973, and it became the staging ground for Norway's darkest fairy tale. Mette-Marit Høiby was the youngest of four, and a child of ordinary Norway. The family had a normal working life, modest routines, and the codes of a place sometimes called the country's Bible Belt. Her parents, Marit Chisholm and Sven Høiby, separated when she was 11. After the divorce, she mainly lived with her mother, visiting her father on weekends, learning early that families can split down the middle and still pretend they're whole. Her father, however, carried trouble on him like a shadow that wouldn't detach. Alcohol, violence, a life that could tilt from charm to damage. Sometimes, when your parent is the unpredictable one, you become a careful child. And so Mette-Marit later described herself as a model teenager. Such a conscientious kid it sounds almost comic, like a girl trying to earn stability by force of will. Then came Australia. At 16, she left Norway as an exchange student, spending a year abroad in 1989, an age when your identity is soft as clay and the right distance can completely change the shape of it. She returned to Norway with something loosened. The good girl script no longer fit. She shaved her head. She stepped into Oslo's 1990s party world, the house parties, the rave scene, the borderless nights of intensity and freedom. In that milieu, boundaries don't just blur, they get treated as old-fashioned suggestions. People around her crossed lines. She crossed some too. Years later, she would admit it plainly, without the poetic fog people use to launder their past. My youthful rebellion was stronger than it was for many people. We stepped over limits, and I'm very sorry about that. She also said, with the blunt clarity of someone defending a younger self she doesn't fully recognize, that it had been important to live contrary to what was accepted. Her education unfolded in fits and pauses. She tried courses, chemistry, IT, ethics, tasting possible lives without really committing to one. She worked some ordinary jobs too, one of the most cited as waitressing at Café Engebret in Oslo, a place where the city's history hangs in the woodwork. She was drifting, learning, trying to locate the self in a country that prizes normality highly and keeps an eye out for anyone who gets too flamboyant. They even have a word for it, or a phrase, Jantelagen, or the law of Janta. In short, don't go around getting above your station in life. Keep your head down. You're nothing special. A complete mirror world to those of us brought up with hardwired English or American individualism and the cult of self-expression. But Mette-Marit's personal life did not drift gently. In the circles she moved through, some men were entangled with drugs and crime. The details would later be picked over with a fervor that felt less like curiosity than moral prosecution. One boyfriend, John Ogilby, had drug convictions. Another figure, Morten Borg, would become crucial. There was a brief romance, a pregnancy, and then prison swallowing the father before the child even arrived. In January 1997, Mette-Marit gave birth to the son, Marius Borg Høiby. She was 23, a single mother, and suddenly anchored to an unexpected infant. Motherhood can be a redemption story, but it's also a pressure test. She lived with her child, and at times with roommates and partners, including 2 DJs in the late 1990s. The press would later paint these details like lurid set dressing. The Oslo nights, music, a sense of chaos, but beneath it sits the plain fact. She raised a boy while her own life still searched for form. She herself was little more than a girl, and she was alone. Norway is, oddly enough, progressive in its laws and often conservative in its instincts. You can do more or less as you please, but there may still be consequences for certain choices. A single mother isn't a scandal in itself, but for a monarchy, especially one that still carries the Lutheran Church in its constitutional bloodstream, it was dynamite waiting for a match. That match struck in summer 1999 at the Court Festival in Kristiansand. A music festival is the kind of rare democratic space where a crown prince can pretend for a few hours that he's just another guy in a crowd. Håkon, Crown Prince of Norway, was there, and so was Mette-Marit. They had actually briefly crossed paths before, but this time something clicked. The heir to the throne and the waitress with the son, the shaved head past, the unfinished education. They were an unlikely pair in a nation that likes its royals both human and harmless. A year and a bit later, the story detonated publicly. On the 1st of December 2000, Håkon announced his engagement to Mette-Marit. There were people who saw it as a modern fairy tale, and other people who saw it as proof the fairy tale had gone rotten. The critique was specific, not abstract. It was her associations, her past, her lack of formal achievements, her child born out of wedlock. Even within the royal orbit, disapproval leaked out. Princess Ragnhild, Håkon's aunt, did not keep her powder dry. She said she hoped she would never live to see the day Mette-Marit became queen, a pretty extraordinary public shot from inside the family. Then the couple added fuel. During their engagement, Håkon and Mette-Marit lived together in Oslo. Cohabitation wasn't exactly rare in Norway's adult population, but a future king doing it was something else. As head of the Church of Norway in constitutional terms, the monarch carries symbolic responsibility, even if it was an example literally no one was following. Still, the Church disapproved. The old architecture of Norwegian monarchy, founded on moral authority via seeming modesty, creaked under the strain. What followed was one of the most remarkable image pivots in modern European royal history, not because it was slick, but because it was surprisingly raw. In August 2001, 3 days before the wedding, Mette-Marit faced cameras at a nationally televised press conference and did what royals almost never do: she confessed. She didn't hide behind lawyers' phrasing or haughty palace euphemisms. She spoke about the wild years, about crossing limits, about regret. She condemned drugs, explicitly, and asked, almost pleaded, for the public to let her close the door on that chapter. The tears weren't theatrical. They look like the kind that arrive when you realize your private life has become a national referendum and you don't get a vote. It worked, if not exactly as absolution, then as a kind of truce. It was heartfelt, honest, and left a lot of Norwegians wondering if they didn't have the odd E-fueled rave or regrettable night of passion in the closet. So, on the 25th of August 2001, she married Crown Prince Håkon in Oslo Cathedral. The wedding was grand, but the most arresting image wasn't a tiara. It was her 4-year-old son Marius, present and visible, included in the whole thing rather than hidden away. In royal terms, that was radical. A future crown princess arriving with someone else's child and insisting the monarchy absorb him as family. After the wedding, the real labour began. Turning a person into an institution without erasing what made her legible to ordinary people. Mette-Marit had to become something like a public servant wrapped in symbolism. In the early years, her past remained a ghost in headlines, summoned whenever the press needed drama. But she started building a record. She took on roles in development work. An internship at Norway's aid agency, NORAD, drew a bit of criticism because it highlighted the rather considerable gap between her new royal platform and any actual formal expertise. Still, she kept moving, carving out areas where her presence could do more than decorate. One of the defining threads became HIV and AIDS work. In 2006, she was appointed an International Goodwill Ambassador for UNAIDS. It was serious terrain. This was a world of stigma, sexuality, youth vulnerability, and the uneven geography of healthcare. She traveled, listened, spoke about young people as leaders rather than passive victims. The job suited her in an unexpected way. A woman who had been publicly shamed for a wild youth became a royal voice arguing for compassion and practical solidarity. She wasn't preaching from untouched purity. She was preaching from a life that knew how easily people slide into danger. Literature became another anchor. Norway, for all its oil wealth, is a nation that spends on literature rather than Lamborghinis, and Mette-Marit made reading a royal cause. She appeared at literary events, promoting authors, eventually taking on a formal role as an ambassador for Norwegian literature internationally. Anyone familiar with Ibsen, Hamsun, or Jo Nesbø can testify to Norway's breadth and depth of prose, and this was a serious business. It was also a clever and genuine pairing, a crown princess without aristocratic pedigree, aligning herself with something Norway already respects. She also co-founded the Maverick Collective under the Crown Prince and Crown Princesses Foundation, focusing on women's health and development. The public-facing image was clear: modern monarchy, real issues, and a crown being used as a microphone rather than a shield. Meanwhile, the family expanded. In 2004, she gave birth to Princess Ingrid Alexandra. In 2005, to Prince Severi Magnus. Ingrid Alexandra's significance is constitutional and symbolic. She became second in line to the throne, and so positioned to become Norway's first reigning queen in modern centuries. The births secured succession, and in a quieter way, helped stabilize Mette-Marit's legitimacy. She wasn't just the controversial spouse anymore, she was mother to the future. By around 2010, she had something like redemption in the public imagination. International observers praised the couple's informal, contemporary style. She was named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. For a while, the narrative felt almost resolved. The girl from Kristiansand who once shaved her head and drifted through Oslo nights had become a functioning piece of the state. But a monarchy doesn't live on resumes alone. It lives on judgment, and judgment is where her story keeps snagging. In 2012, she traveled quietly to India to help a Norwegian gay couple, friends within the royal circle, collect newborn twins born via surrogacy. In human terms, it can read as compassionate: babies in need, parents delayed, a friend stepping in. In political terms, it was explosive. Surrogacy was banned in Norway. Critics argued that international surrogacy can exploit poor women and reduce human bodies to mere contracts to fulfill. Women's rights activists accused her of crossing into something like human trafficking territory. The story landed in Norway's debate space where ethics, feminism, law, and royal symbolism collide. It wasn't a scandal of sex or money, it was a scandal of moral authority. A crown princess doesn't get to be just a friend, the way ordinary people do. Her private actions leak into national values. That controversy eventually cooled. Then came the kind of news that rewrites a life's tempo: illness. In October 2018, the Royal Court announced that Mette-Marit had pulmonary fibrosis, a chronic lung disease. The phrasing was clinical, but the implications were serious. Breathing, something you never think about until it becomes hard work, would now be unreliable. She spoke openly, telling the world her capacity would vary and that she would need periods without public programming. Over time, she scaled back her appearances. There were cancellations, sick leaves, a gradual quieting of her public presence. In a monarchy, absence has its own symbolism. It invites empathy, sometimes, but it also creates a vacuum where speculation loves to live. In the early 2020s, as her health fluctuated, other forces gathered. The biggest was an association that, in retrospect, reads like a catastrophic lapse: Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was already a convicted sex offender when Mette-Marit met him in 2011. The relationship, hidden at first, surfaced publicly in 2019 amid the global shockwave of Epstein's arrest and death. The palace issued an apology on her behalf. She went through the motions that we're all familiar with by now from those who crossed Epstein's path. She regretted the contact, implied she hadn't understood the extent of his crimes, and said the connection had ended years earlier. It was damaging but survivable, in the way some royal scandals are survivable, contained by time, managed by statements, and the silent wheels of power suddenly turning at full speed to cover a whole forest of tracks. Then, new disclosures arrived, and the earlier story looked less like naivete and more like straight-up evasion. In late 2025 and early 2026, the next batch of unsealed Epstein files revealed extensive references to the Crown Princess. Reports described hundreds of emails and an intimacy of tone that contradicted the idea of a brief, distant acquaintance. In one email, she joked that she had just Googled him and that it, quote, didn't look too good, punctured with an emoji. A friendly jab that suggested full awareness of his record, even as the contact continued. Other messages veered into awkward personal territory, including jokes about adultery and so-called wife hunting, as well as a strange off-color question about whether artwork involving nude women was suitable for her teenage son's room. She had also stayed at Epstein's Palm Beach home for several days in 2013, reportedly while he was away. The cumulative effect was not just moral disgust, it was a total credibility rupture. The question shifted from why did she ever meet him to why did she tell the public so little? Others wanted to know what exactly Epstein's interest in her was. A weak link? A soft underbelly to Norway's heart? All we have is speculation. Mette-Marit issued another apology, harsher toward herself this time. She said she showed poor judgment, that it was, quote, simply embarrassing, and expressed sympathy for Epstein's victims. But apologies don't reverse the timeline, and they don't erase the feeling that a royal, someone whose entire job is judgment wrapped in symbolism, failed to make the most obvious call, don't befriend a convicted sexual predator. The timing was brutal, because while the Epstein revelations widened, another story swallowed Norway's attention: her son. Marius Borg-Høiby, the boy who walked beside his mother at the cathedral in 2001, grew up in the palace's orbit but without a royal title. The family emphasized he was a private citizen. In theory, that distinction protects the monarchy. In practice, Norway knows exactly who he is. In 2024, he was arrested amid an investigation that began with domestic violence allegations. Then the case expanded into something far darker. By 2025, prosecutors had laid out a sweeping indictment, dozens of charges including alleged rapes of 4 women, assaults, threats and drug offenses, stretching back years. Reports said some assaults were even filmed. The accusations were the kind that make a country go silent and then furious. This wasn't gossip. This was the criminal code. Norwegian historians called it the biggest scandal in the monarchy's modern history. Haakon spoke publicly with careful empathy, concern for those affected, an acknowledgement that Marius is loved but not part of the royal institution, an insistence that the case belongs in court. The palace kept its distance, stating that it was for the justice system to handle. Mette-Marit did not appear in court. The message was clear: no special treatment. But for the public, the distinction between private citizen and royal family doesn't hold so cleanly. People began asking ugly but very real questions. Was he protected? Was he enabled by proximity to power? Did anyone in the palace know more than they said? There were also reports, unverified and corrosive, that she might have tried to shield him, warning him, or even helping with evidence. No charge has been filed against her on that front, but the rumors alone show how quickly suspicion grows when a monarchy loses moral clarity. At the same time, her illness progressed. By early 2026, there were indications the pulmonary fibrosis had worsened, and doctors reportedly advised that a lung transplant would become necessary. Imagine that collision: a woman whose lungs are failing, whose private emails are turning into public evidence exhibits, whose eldest child stands accused of terrible harm, and who is still expected, by the nature of her role, to remain composed, useful, presentable. Royalty, in its modern European form, is often sold as ceremonial work with nice outfits. The reality is pressure. The state's need for continuity poured into a human nervous system. Public opinion shifted sharply. Polls began to show rising discomfort with the idea of her as queen consort one day. Norway's monarchy has survived because it mirrors the country's egalitarian self-image of being modest, stable, and mostly decent. Mette-Marit once embodied a modernizing leap, a crown prince marrying a single mother with a complicated past, a story that suggested the monarchy could reflect real life. Now she risks embodying the opposite, that modernity, without judgment, turns the monarchy into another theatre of scandal. In other words, they were beginning to resemble their altogether more louche British cousins. And yet, to reduce her life to one of pure scandal is to miss the strange complexity of it. She did not arrive as a polished aristocrat. She arrived as someone shaped by the ordinary fractures of family life, by a father's addiction and violence, by a youth that tested limits in ways she later regretted publicly. She also arrived with a child, insisting that the monarchy, if it wanted to be modern, would have to make room for a kind of family reality it had rarely shown. For years she worked. She traveled for humanitarian causes. She gave attention to HIV and youth leadership. She promoted literature in a country that treats books as civic health. She did the long repetitive labor of royal duty, shaking hands, opening buildings, showing up, while carrying a body that eventually began to fail her. Her story then becomes a question Norway now seems to be asking itself. What does redemption mean when the person is not merely an individual but a symbol? In 2001, she asked the public to let her past recede. Many did. They watched her become a functioning crown princess and felt a kind of national pride in the monarchy's flexibility. The later controversies, surrogacy, Epstein, Marius, make that forgiveness feel to some like a mistake. To others, they make it feel tragic, a life that could have settled into quiet service, instead spiraling into the kind of public ordeal no one can fully control. The palace's communications carry a different tone now, less of the bright future, more of the cautious present tense. Haakon takes on more of the daily representation, a role he was born to, after all. Their children, especially Ingrid Alexandra, begin to carry symbolic weight as the future that might outlast the current turbulence. In a way, that may be Mette-Marit's final active role in the monarchy's narrative, as the mother of a new era, even while her own era is bruised by her own indiscretions. Ingrid Alexandra's eventual reign, if it comes to pass, will be read partly through what she learned from her parents. Haakon's steady public integrity, Mette-Marit's hard-won experience with scrutiny, her warnings written in real time across headlines. No doubt we live in an age of sharpening pitchforks. The general public is more restless with its lapsing authority figures than it has been in a century. Will they find a way to prove their worth, or will Western society begin another of its uncontrolled, wild and unpredictable periods of revolving? Only history holds the answer. Norway will decide over time whether her story becomes a cautionary tale or a grimly human chapter in a monarchy that insisted it could be modern without losing its soul. Alright, quite interesting to cover something topical for a change. Let me know what you think about her rise and fall. She's certainly a controversial character, but then she's also one of us swept up in a very strange world. Anyway, I've been Chester, thanks for tuning in to Society Mysteries. If you want to get these episodes a bit early and support the channel, have a look at the YouTube members area. Cheers, and I'll see you next time.